Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little quieter. Not calm, not restful, just oppressively, uncomfortably quiet. Imagine stone corridors where whispers are forbidden, cold meals are a blessing, and your alarm clock is a bell tolling at 3 a.m. Not for fun, for God. We're not talking about nights or feasts or those overly romanticized medieval banquets. Tonight, we're entering the walls of a medieval monastery. A place where sleep is rationed, joy is suspect, and personal space is a sinful luxury. Forget what you think you know. You wouldn't last a week, realistically, not even a full day. So before you mentally prepare to renounce all earthly pleasure, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, historical unraveling. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? I always love seeing this sleepy little global community come together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe grab a scratchy blanket and a crust of bread, because tonight, we're trading comfort for devotion and silence. Lots and lots of silence. Let's ease into the long, echoing halls of the monastic life, together. The first thing you notice is the bell. Not music, not birds, just the heavy, metallic groan of a monastery bell, echoing through stone walls at an hour your soul doesn't recognize as real. It's not an alarm, it's a summons, a reminder that even sleep belongs to God now. You don't wake up so much as you surrender. Your body creaks like the wooden cot you're laying on, a slab of timber with a straw-filled sack that generously calls itself a mattress. There's no pillow, there's no blanket, just a coarse linen sheet, slightly damp from the cold, and a robe that smells faintly of mildew, smoke, and centuries of regret. There is no talking, no yawning, no grumbling, just the soft shuffle of dozens of sandaled feet hitting cold stone floors in near-perfect unison. The air is icy, not winter icy, medieval icy, the kind that bites through stone, through fabric, and eventually through spirit. You're not cold, you're part of the cold now. Your breath fogs slightly as you dress in silence. The robe is scratchy, the rope belt tighter than you remember, and the sandals have no padding. But none of that matters. You're already late. You fall into line, always in line. A silent river of drowsy, obedient monks flowing down a dim hallway lit only by candlelight. No one makes eye contact. No one sneezes. If you stub your toe on a loose flagstone, and you will, you don't flinch. You just keep walking. The chapel is colder than your cell. Stone everywhere. The walls, the benches, the altar. Even the air feels like stone, unmoving, unkind. You kneel. Your knees complain. You ignore them. God doesn't accept excuses, only devotion, preferably in Latin. The prayers begin. You don't understand most of them. They've been memorized, repeated so often they barely register as words anymore. Just a soft, rhythmic murmur, like rain on stone or wind in catacombs. Some monks fall asleep mid-prayer. That's normal. That's expected. No one wakes them. No one speaks. It's called matins, the first of many services. And yes, it's pitch black outside. The sun won't rise for hours. You don't pray because you feel inspired. You pray because that's what's written on the board. You pray because that's what everyone else is doing. And also, because the prior is watching, and he remembers. After an hour or so, the bell rings again, not to dismiss you, just to move you. You shuffle out as quietly as you entered, back to your cell, not to rest. That would be indulgent. Just to prepare for the next round of stillness. It's still only 4:30 a.m. You've prayed once, you've spoken 0 words, and you've already committed 5 sins in your thoughts, mostly about warmth, sleep, and the smell of bread you imagined but didn't get. This is the start of your day, and it will not get easier. By now, the sky has begun to pale, not sunrise, just a faint suggestion that the world outside might still exist, but inside the monastery, light and darkness are irrelevant. The day is measured by bells, not by sun. The next bell tolls. You stand again, for lauds, morning praise, still silent, still half asleep. Your knees creak like poorly oiled hinges, and your spine has filed an official complaint. But complaints are secular luxuries. You murmur your verses, your Latin wobbly, your mind drifting. Maybe today will be different. It won't be. After prayers, you're allowed a brief moment for personal preparation, which does not mean breakfast. It means another robe check, a silent nod from the overseer, and a quick, unsatisfying splash of icy water on your face, as if that will somehow replace coffee, which hasn't been invented yet, and wouldn't be allowed anyway. Then comes labor. Manual, of course. No books yet. No sitting. You might be assigned to the garden, yanking weeds from soil that feels more rock than earth. Or to the fields, if your monastery owns any. Maybe the kitchens, where you'll peel root vegetables that somehow all taste the same, regardless of colour. If you're unlucky, you'll be on latrine duty. If you're really unlucky, you'll be copying manuscripts, a task that involves zero creativity and maximum back pain. Another bell. You stop. Drop the hoe. Wipe your hands. Return to the chapel. It's time for terci, another set of prayers, another hour of stillness. If you're keeping count, this is prayer service number 3, and the sun still hasn't fully risen. Back to work. The bell doesn't ask. It commands. Maybe now you're chopping wood, or hauling water from a well that somehow seems farther every time. Maybe you're patching cloaks, or sweeping endless stone corridors where dust seems to breed in defiance of divine will. By midday, you've worked for hours, eaten nothing, and spoken no words. You may be wondering when the first meal happens. Soon. But first, sext, more prayer. Then the meal. It's not joyful. It's not social. You enter the refectory in silence. You sit. A scripture is read aloud, usually about sin, while you chew your bread, slowly. Your soup is more suggestion than substance. It tastes like boiled humility. The bread is hard enough to chip enamel. The portions are small. This is intentional. Afterward, it's none. Another prayer. You're full, but not really. You're tired, but not allowed to rest. You're still alive, and therefore expected to be useful. More work. Or, if it's your turn, reading scripture aloud to the others while they labour. Slowly, monotonously. No jokes, no metaphors. Just endless lines of sacred text you barely understand. As the sun lowers, the prayers increase. Vespers, then compline. That makes 7 or 8 canonical hours, depending on how strictly your monastery follows the rule. Your day ends as it began, with silence, fatigue, and sore knees. You've prayed more than you've eaten. You've bent more than you've sat. And sleep? Still not guaranteed. But don't worry. There's always tomorrow. And it will look exactly the same. By now, you've noticed something's missing. Not the food, not the sleep. It's sound. There is no idle chatter, no whispered jokes, no spontaneous humming while sweeping, only the echo of your own sandals, the occasional bell, the scrape of a bowl. And sometimes, the sound of your stomach making an unholy noise it probably needs to repent for. The silence isn't accidental, it's sacred. In many medieval monastic orders, speaking was considered dangerous, not physically, but spiritually. Words can tempt, words can wound. Words can distract, and distraction leads to sin, so silence became the solution. In some monasteries, a monk could go days, weeks, even months without speaking a single word aloud, unless given express permission or participating in designated chanting. The mouth stayed shut. Not locked, just erased from daily life. Need to ask for something? Use signs. Thirsty? Touch your lips. Need the bathroom? Point awkwardly toward the exit and hope someone understands. Want to scream into the void because you've had 4 hours of sleep and just spilled lentil soup on your only robe? Keep that inside. That's between you and God. At first, the silence is uncomfortable, like an itch you can't scratch. You want to say something, anything, a greeting, a sigh, a muttered complaint about the weather. But all of that is noise. All of that is forbidden. Then comes the next phase, awareness. Suddenly, your mind becomes very loud. You start hearing things you've never noticed. The creak of your neighbour's spine every time they kneel. The soft rustle of robe fabric as someone shifts in prayer. The exact pattern of your own breathing. Your thoughts, once background noise, now echo like sermons. You remember awkward conversations from 10 years ago. You question your life choices. You wonder what dirt tastes like. You start composing imaginary arguments with people who aren't even here, and then you apologize for it. Silently, of course. Eventually, you stop trying to fill the silence. You let it engulf you. It becomes the air you breathe, the weight you carry, and in a strange, slightly unsettling way. It starts to feel like a kind of companionship, but it's not peace. Not really. It's just suppression. Holy, disciplined suppression. You begin to realize how much of modern life is made of words, greetings, gossip, complaints, bad jokes, polite lies. Here, none of that exists. There are no, "How are you?" No, "Good jobs." No, "Are you okay?" S. You're not praised. You're not comforted. You're not acknowledged, except as a shape in a robe, doing what shapes in robes are expected to do. Your only real voice is your inner one, and the longer you sit with it, the louder it becomes. Some monks claimed this was when they heard God. Others just heard regret. Either way, the silence never leaves. Even when you're finally allowed to speak, you won't want to. Because silence changes you. Not quickly, not violently, just slowly, like water on stone. Let's talk about food, or rather, the absence of it. In the medieval monastery, eating isn't pleasure. It isn't comfort. It isn't even nourishment, really. It's a brief, ritualized interruption between one round of prayer and the next. A silent, coordinated act of survival, flavored mostly with guilt. Meals are taken in the refectory, a long, echoing hall where monks sit in silence, facing each other but never speaking. There is no table conversation, no passing of the salt, no, "How's your day going?" Because your day, just like theirs, is long, cold, and full of vegetables. The food itself? Mostly grains, some boiled legumes, the occasional root, and bread. Lots of bread. Not the soft, fluffy, fragrant kind. Number. This bread could be used as building material. Dense. Hard. Dry enough to make you question your dental stability. You soak it in watery broth just to avoid injury. Meat? Never. That's for nobles. Or sick people. You're neither. Even fish is limited, and only allowed on specific holy days, not because it's delicious, but because it's technically not meat. Theology, it seems, is flexible when hunger is involved. The typical meal is called pottage, a thick, greyish stew made from whatever didn't rot that week. It contains beans, leeks, barley, sometimes onions, and always disappointment. It is served warm when you're lucky, lukewarm when you're not, and cold if you're late, which you shouldn't be, because lateness is a sin, and sins lead to less soup. And while you eat, you don't speak. You listen, not to music, not to news, but to scripture, read aloud by a rotating monk from a pulpit. Often these readings involve death, sin, punishment, or reminders that earthly pleasure leads directly to eternal suffering, all while you try to chew kale boiled into spiritual submission. Seconds? Number? Snacks? Never. Dessert? That's not even a concept. Portions are small by design. Hunger is considered holy. Fullness is indulgence. To feel satisfied is to risk sin. So you learn to eat just enough to keep standing, and even that feels like a privilege. During Lent, it gets worse. Much worse. Portions are cut. Meals reduced to once a day. No oil, no dairy, no cheer. Just more roots, more bread, and more contemplation of suffering. Yours, and Christ's, and preferably in that order. You don't eat to live. You eat to continue serving. Food is fuel, but also a test of patience, of discipline, of your ability to chew bark-flavored barley without wincing. And strangely, after a while, you stop noticing the taste. Not because it gets better, but because you forget that food ever meant anything more. Sleep, in the monastery, is not a right. It's a concession, a small, fragile window between obligations, allowed, but only in fragments, and never with comfort. Your bed, if we can call it that, is a wooden platform with a straw sack tossed on top. The sack smells like old hay and damp fabric. You're allowed a single coarse sheet, maybe two if it's winter, and the prior is feeling generous. There is no pillow, no cushion, and certainly no mattress topper. If you roll over in the night, the bed creaks like a guilty conscience. You sleep in a communal dormitory. The room is long, cold, and silent. Windows are narrow and high, letting in little light and less warmth. The air smells faintly of wax, wool, and old effort. Your neighbours are all robed, silent, breathing slowly, or snoring through the nose because open-mouth snoring would be too undisciplined. Privacy doesn't exist. Neither does personal space. Your cot is exactly arm's length from the next, which means if someone shifts in their sleep, you feel it, not physically, but spiritually. It's an ecosystem of exhausted men, all trying not to move too much, or too little, or at the wrong time. You lie down early, shortly after compline, the final prayer of the day. But sleep does not come easily, not just because of the straw, not just because your knees still ache from kneeling on stone, but because you know it won't last. At some indeterminate point in the middle of the night, usually around 3 a.m., the bell rings again, that same hollow clang echoing through your bones. It's time for matins, the first prayer service of the new day. You rise, not refreshed, but rehearsed. Your limbs are stiff. Your robe feels heavier than it did at sunset. You shuffle with the others, half asleep and fully obedient, into the chapel for more Latin, more kneeling, and more silence. After matins, you return to your cot. But this is not sleep. This is holding still with your eyes closed and hoping your brain shuts up. Eventually, your body surrenders again, not peacefully, just in quiet resignation. But even this second round of sleep is short. By dawn, another bell calls you for lauds, and the cycle continues. The result is a life of fragmented rest, 2 to 4 hours at a time, interrupted by bells, prayers, cold feet, and the knowledge that you must wake again and again and again. Your dreams become brief, muted things. They start and stop mid-scene. You dream of warmth, of beds with sides, of sleep uninterrupted by bells. You dream of sleeping in, only to wake in guilt. Or worse, panic that you've missed a prayer and earned a punishment. Over time, you forget what deep sleep feels like. You start to believe this is normal, because here, it is. Monastic sleep is not restorative. It's not indulgent. It's maintenance, like watering a dying plant just enough to keep the leaves from falling off. You sleep enough to keep functioning, barely. And yet, somehow, you carry on. Not because you're rested, but because the rule says you must. You dream less, you feel less, but you obey more. And that, in the monastery, is what counts. At some point, you're told to report to the library. That sounds promising. Books, quiet, maybe a wooden chair that doesn't injure your spine. But then you remember, you're in a medieval monastery. This isn't a place of reading for pleasure. This is a sanctified bureaucracy of ink, parchment, and endless repetition. The library is not cozy. It's not warm. There are no armchairs, no lantern-lit nooks, and absolutely no fiction. There is only cold stone, long tables, and shelves of chained books. Because yes, in a world where each manuscript takes months to make, they are considered too valuable to trust to free movement. Books don't belong to monks. They belong to God, and God doesn't lend. You're not here to read anyway. You're here to copy. You're handed a quill, a knife, and a piece of vellum. Not paper. That's far too modern. This is animal skin, stretched and scraped until it's flat enough to write on, and stiff enough to remind you that you're working on something that used to bleat. The quill feels awkward. It scratches, skips, and leaks ink at the worst moments. Your job is not to express thought. Your job is to duplicate it, perfectly. Every line, every mark, every abbreviation, even if you don't know what it means. Creativity is a sin in this room. Precision is salvation. The room is quiet, of course, but not peaceful. You hear the scraping of knives against parchment, used to fix mistakes by literally shaving the surface. You hear the soft muttering of monks counting lines, checking margins, whispering Latin as they transcribe. The work is slow, painfully so. You might finish a page per day. If you're lucky, if your ink doesn't blot, if your hand doesn't cramp, if the prior doesn't stop by and notice your R looks too ambitious. If you make a mistake, it's not just frowned upon, it's recorded. Margins were sometimes filled with angry notes from supervising monks. Things like, "Who let this man write?" Or, "God forgive this hand." Not encouraging, but technically spiritual. Sometimes, you're allowed to read what you've copied. It won't help much. Everything is written in Latin, in a cramped Gothic script designed more to conserve space than to be legible. Even if you know the words, the handwriting fights you. The content? Religious texts. Commentaries on religious texts. Commentaries on the commentaries. You may spend a week copying a single sermon about the dangers of over-seasoned food. Spoiler, it's all sinful. You're not encouraged to think. You're not encouraged to reflect. You're encouraged to repeat. This is not a room for learning. It is a room for preserving, slowly, painfully, eternally. And it never ends. When you finish one manuscript, you're given another. If you work quickly, you're punished, because speed suggests carelessness. If you work too slowly, you're also punished, because vellum is expensive, and God doesn't waste. Your back begins to ache. Your eyes blur. You forget what day it is, what book you're on, what chapter. You forget why you ever thought the library would be a break. It's not a break. It's a different kind of labor. Quieter, yes, but just as relentless. And yet, you continue, line by line, word by word. Because in the monastery, writing is worship. And worship never ends. There's a question modern minds tend to ask when imagining life in a medieval monastery. Did they at least get to wash? The answer is yes. Technically. But washing didn't mean what you hope it means. There are no daily showers, no hot water, no steam rising from a private bath with lavender-scented soap. What you get is a basin, maybe some cold water, and a cloth that hasn't been truly clean since the prior was a teenager. Bathing is rare, often restricted to certain feast days or seasonal changes. Once a week, if you're in a particularly generous order. Once a month, more commonly. Not because monks didn't care about hygiene, but because water had to be hauled, heated, and shared. And heating water was a luxury reserved for illness, frostbite, or very important visitors. You are none of those things. Instead, you rely on surface cleaning. Hands, face, maybe feet, if time allows. The rest is handled by prayer and divine tolerance. Odors? Natural, sweat, holy, dirt, humbling. Your robe doesn't help. It's made of rough wool, thick, heavy, and eager to retain every smell it meets. You wear it every day, all day, in the garden, in the chapel, in the library. You sleep in it, you pray in it, you sweat in it. Washing it requires time, water, soap, and permission. You usually have none of those. Underneath, there's a tunic, equally unwashed, equally loyal to your scent. And then there's the matter of company. Not the monks. The smaller companions. Chances are, you're sharing your robe with lice, maybe fleas, possibly both. It's common. It's expected. You're told it's a test, a trial of humility. Some monks refer to them as God's little thorns, tiny reminders that the flesh is weak and the kingdom of heaven requires patience. Also scratching. You try not to itch during prayer. It's considered disruptive. But at 3 a.m., half asleep, you start to bargain with God. Just let me scratch once, and I'll copy double tomorrow. The latrine, if you're wondering, is communal, basic, and extremely cold. A row of stone or wooden seats over a trench, usually without partitions. You go when the group goes. You don't talk. You don't linger. You don't expect privacy. Just relief, and the hope that the wind is not blowing in the wrong direction today. Toilet paper, as you imagine it, does not exist. You use what's available. Moss, cloth scraps, sometimes nothing at all. The experience is brief, but unforgettable. Teeth? There's no toothbrush, no paste. You might rinse with water, maybe chew on twigs, but mostly your teeth just exist, until they don't. Cavities are ignored. Toothaches are endured. And if a tooth must come out, it does, usually without ceremony, anesthesia, or regret. One less mouthful of pain to worry about. And yet, you adjust. Your skin becomes rough. Your hands are permanently stained with soil and ink. Your nails, chipped. Your hair, oily. But none of this matters here. Not because monks don't notice, they do, but because noticing it too much is considered vanity. Vanity is the enemy. Cleanliness is only next to godliness when it doesn't distract from your real duties. Prayer, labor, silence. Eventually, you stop wondering what you smell like, because you smell like everyone else. Like wool, like wax, like damp stone, like a man who's been up since 3 a.m. and hasn't stopped since. In the monastery, hygiene is not about comfort. It's about endurance, and sometimes surrender. Contrary to what some might imagine, monks did not spend their entire day floating silently between candles and manuscripts. They didn't just kneel, chant, and vanish into clouds of incense. They worked. A lot. Because monasteries didn't run on miracles, they ran on manual labor. In fact, most monastic rules, especially the famous Rule of St. Benedict, emphasized work as prayer. Labor wasn't just permitted, it was required. To toil with your hands was to serve both God and the community, and also to make sure things didn't fall apart. Your day is carved into alternating chunks of prayer and work. Think of it as spiritual interval training. Pray. Haul wood. Pray. Dig trenches. Pray. Shovel manure. Repeat until divine enlightenment or complete muscle failure. Jobs vary depending on your monastery's needs and your unfortunate skill set. If you're strong, you're sent to the fields, breaking soil, planting seeds, pulling weeds that seem to grow specifically out of spite. The tools are simple: spades, hoes, baskets. The expectations are not. You rise before the sun, and you don't stop until the bell says otherwise. If you're unlucky, you're tasked with gathering firewood, trudging through forests, dragging back bundles twice your weight, fending off splinters, thorns, and the creeping suspicion that trees are watching you. Some monks draw water from wells, over and over, buckets, yokes, blisters. You develop shoulders, but not the kind poets admire, the kind that ache when you lie down and scream when you lift a spoon. Other duties, kitchen work, not cooking. Usually that's for the brother with the steadiest hands. But you might be chopping turnips, grinding oats, or cleaning soot-blackened pots large enough to boil a man. Not that anyone would, hopefully. Then there's maintenance, fixing roofs, mending fences, patching robes, repairing the tools you broke, repairing other tools. You don't wait for things to fall apart. You assume they will. And you prepare, with rope, nails, and low expectations. There's gardening, which sounds peaceful until you're ankle-deep in mud, trying to coax life from a patch of earth that responds only to pleading and manure. There's animal care. If your monastery keeps livestock, feeding, milking, cleaning stalls, avoiding horns, no pets, just responsibilities that moo. There are brewmasters in some abbeys, monks who make beer. You will not be one of them. That job is sacred, selective, and far from where you're currently standing, knee-deep in compost, wondering how long it takes to become spiritually immune to bad smells. Work is constant. There are no weekends, no holidays, no, I think I'll rest today. The only break you get is prayer, and that's not a break, just a quieter form of obligation. Your hands blister, your back bends, your knees complain in 3 languages, but the rule is clear. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, so you keep moving, because stillness is dangerous, and being seen as lazy, worse than heresy. And so the labor continues, without applause, without reward. Only the knowledge that when someone needs more firewood, or fewer weeds, or a pit dug for reasons no one will explain, you'll be there. Because you are a monk, and in the monastery, everyone works, even when they pray. At some point, your mind drifts, just a little. You wonder if monks ever relaxed, had fun, shared a laugh, did something, just because they wanted to. The answer, of course, is no. Or more precisely, not in the way you'd recognize. In the monastery, recreation is a foreign concept. The rule doesn't ban it explicitly, it simply forgets it exists. Joy is not sinful, exactly, but it's certainly suspicious. If it doesn't lead to humility, silence, or productivity, it's probably a distraction. And distractions? They lead to ruin. So how do monks unwind? They don't. Not in the way you're thinking. There is no music, at least. None for pleasure. Gregorian chant is permitted, but it's not toe-tapping. It's slow, tonal, sacred. You don't hum it while sweeping. You don't dance to it. You chant it, in unison, in Latin, in a key that hasn't been fashionable since the year 800. There are no instruments lying around. No flutes, no lutes, no drums. Only bells, and even those don't belong to you. There is no art, not personal at least. Some monasteries have illuminated manuscripts or stained glass, but those are devotional, created to glorify God, not to express your feelings. You don't doodle in the margins. You don't paint for fun. You don't draw your favorite vegetable with a silly face. That's not holy. That's heresy with a paintbrush. Jokes are rare. Humor is. Fragile. A dangerous indulgence. It invites levity, and levity opens the door to mockery, and mockery opens the door to pride, and pride, as always, opens the door to hell. So you keep your amusing observations to yourself. Games? There are none. No cards, no dice, no boards, no teams. Leisure is not communal. It's not even individual. It's non-existent. What you get instead is contemplation. You're permitted to go for a walk, slowly, alone, without speaking, while reflecting on sin, mortality, and the briefness of earthly life. You might gaze at a tree. You might stare at a candle. You might sit in a garden, if your monastery has one, and let your mind drift, but not too far. Drifting too far leads to daydreaming, and daydreaming leads to wanting, and wanting is never a good idea. Occasionally, you're given time for spiritual reading, not fiction, not poetry, just the kind of literature that reminds you how flawed and unworthy you are, which, of course, is the point. Some monks took up simple crafts in free moments, basket weaving, basic carpentry, not as hobbies, but as useful skills, something the monastery could use, something God could approve. Idle hands, after all, are the devil's workshop. Better to braid reeds than risk thinking about happiness. If you smile during the day, it's usually because someone dropped a bucket or mispronounced a Latin phrase in a way that technically wasn't blasphemous, but came close. You suppress the grin. You cross yourself. You move on. Eventually, you stop seeking entertainment. You stop expecting novelty. You learn to find stillness in repetition and comfort in monotony. And somewhere along the way, you forget what fun used to feel like. Because here, in the monastery, that feeling has been filed away, tucked behind silence, buried under obedience. Entertainment isn't forbidden. It's just no longer necessary. You would think that living in silence, working all day, eating boiled roots, and waking at 3 a.m. might earn you some spiritual leniency, a little grace. It doesn't, because even in the monastery, rules exist. And where there are rules, there are punishments. Monastic discipline is built not on violence, but on structure, cold, consistent, inescapable structure. You don't get yelled at, you get corrected, firmly, publicly, quietly. Step 1. You break a rule. Maybe you oversleep. Maybe you speak out of turn. Maybe your chant slips off key during lauds. Maybe, God forbid, you look bored during a sermon about eternal damnation. The offense doesn't have to be large. It just has to be noticed. Step 2. You are observed. Not scolded, not warned, simply noted by the prior, or the abbot, or another monk whose job is to watch and report. Silence gives them time to notice everything. And they do. Step 3. The punishment. It varies. Sometimes it's a rebuke, in front of everyone, but delivered in a voice so calm it feels worse than shouting. Sometimes it's a period of exclusion. You're asked to sit farther from the others, or eat alone, or attend prayers in the back row. Still present, just, invisible. Then there are the penitential tasks. Extra fasting, extra prayer, extra labor. You may be assigned to sweep the latrines, by hand, with no tools but a rag, a bucket, and your growing sense of regret. More serious infractions earn public confession. You stand before the whole community and read a statement of guilt. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and slow. followed by silence. No one comforts you. That's not the point. Some rules are so deeply internal that breaking them doesn't look like anything at all. A wandering mind, an impure thought, a flicker of pride. You're expected to confess those voluntarily. If you don't, and someone suspects you've become too comfortable, a spiritual inquiry might begin. It's not official, just a few leading questions. A look, a pause, a reminder. And if you continue to falter, if your soul resists being shaped, the consequences intensify. You might be placed on silent penance, no speaking for a week, which, in a monastery already built on silence, is a special kind of isolation. You're there, but not fully. Worst of all is removal from communal prayer. You're not banned from praying, but you must do it alone, apart from the group. In a place where belonging is your only anchor, that kind of solitude feels like exile. Even God, in that moment, seems farther away. Still, no one strikes you. No whips, no dungeons, just systems, and eyes, and time. Punishment here is less about pain, more about pressure, quiet pressure, holy pressure. The kind that bends your will 1 degree at a time until obedience feels like instinct. Eventually, you learn to discipline yourself before anyone else needs to. You speak more carefully. You kneel more precisely. You confess more quickly. Not because you're afraid of being punished, but because the structure begins to feel correct. The rule becomes a rhythm. The rhythm becomes a cage. And the cage becomes home. You no longer ask, what happens if I slip? You ask, how can I make sure I don't? Because in the monastery, discipline isn't just how you stay in line. It's how you become the line itself. There's a door at the edge of the monastery wall. It's old, thick, made of oak and iron. It creaks when opened, but most days it stays shut. Not because it's locked, but because no one asks to leave. Technically, monks aren't prisoners. You weren't dragged here. You came by choice, or more likely, by the combined forces of poverty, family pressure, or a vague promise that this would bring your soul closer to salvation. Still, once you're inside, freedom becomes a memory. The outside world fades like a dream after waking. You no longer walk where you wish. You no longer speak when you want. You no longer choose what to eat, what to wear, or what to think about past a certain point. And slowly, you stop needing to. The monastery is a machine, a quiet, relentless one. You are a cog, a robe-shaped component with a list of duties and a schedule etched in bells. And when every day looks the same, when every hour is accounted for, when every word must be weighed, what does freedom even mean anymore? There is no marriage, no romance, no family of your own. You have brothers, yes, but they are not yours. They are God's. Like you belong to the community. You belong to the rule. You belong to the rhythm of bells and candles and knees against stone. You belong to something larger. And that sounds noble, until you realize you no longer belong to yourself. Your name, the one you were born with, may be replaced. You take on a religious name, a symbol of rebirth, of letting go, but it also erases. You forget the sound of people saying your name with warmth. Now, it's just duty. Identity stripped down to function. Some monks adapt easily. They thrive in the structure, in the simplicity. They seem peaceful. But even they, in the silence, must sometimes hear the echo of the world outside, the clatter of markets, the laughter of children, the sound of footsteps going wherever they please. You don't miss comfort as much as you miss possibility. Not having a choice is easier than always choosing, but it dulls something inside you. When the bell rings, you move. Not because someone orders you, but because that's who you are now, a person shaped by bells. There are moments when your old life flickers. A memory of running, of dancing, of sleeping in. You feel it for a second, and then you bow your head and you let it go. You are not here to be happy. You are here to be good, or at least to try. And if you do question things, quietly, in the privacy of your own thoughts, there is always scripture, always a rule, always a brother nearby who seems unshakably devoted, as if he never once dreamed of the outside. You tell yourself that obedience is strength, that discipline is freedom, that humility is the truest form of power. You say it enough times, and it becomes true, or true enough. Because here's the thing, the monastery doesn't need to lock its doors. By the time you feel the urge to leave, you've forgotten how to open them. This place is a loop. You wake, pray, work, eat, kneel, repeat. Not for a week, not for a season, but for decades, until your knees fail, until your sight fades, until your voice, rarely used, becomes a whisper, until one day you simply do not rise for matins. And even then, someone else takes your place in line, seamlessly, quietly, like a ripple fading into still water. You were never the point. The rhythm was. So yes, you are not free, but you are part of something enduring. Stone and prayer and silence. A sacred machine that doesn't stop for individuals. And maybe, just maybe, that's what you wanted all along. So now you know. Monastic life in the Middle Ages wasn't peaceful. It wasn't poetic. It was cold. It was rigid. It was quiet in ways that made your own thoughts too loud to bear. You woke in darkness. You labored in silence. You prayed on schedule. You slept in fragments. And in between, you slowly erased the self, one vow at a time. There were no hobbies, no comforts, no breaks. Your body belonged to labor. Your voice belonged to scripture. Your mind belonged to God. And your soul? It was being shaped, or stripped, depending on how you looked at it. And yet, monks stayed. Some for years, some for life. Not because it was easy, but because, somehow, the stillness gave them meaning. In a world of war, famine, and fleeting glory, they chose repetition, simplicity, obedience not as burden, but as path. Could you do the same? Could you rise before dawn, kneel until your legs tremble, and whisper prayers into a chapel that never answers back? Could you eat in silence, bathe in cold, and call that devotion? Maybe. But probably not for long, because you weren't built for this. You were built for noise, for choice, for comfort. The medieval monastery was not a place for most people, and that's precisely the point. So, as you lie there now, warm, fed, free, take a breath, be grateful, and let the thought of stone walls, distant bells, and a bed made of straw lull you gently into sleep. Good night. The Crusades were a series of religious and military campaigns that spanned over several centuries, primarily aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. These expeditions, which began in the late 11th century, were initiated by the Catholic Church and had far-reaching consequences not only for the participants, but for Europe and the wider world. Understanding the Crusades. The origins of the Crusades can be traced to a mixture of religious fervor and the political ambitions of European monarchs. At the time, Jerusalem held immense religious significance for Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, as it was the site of major events in the life of Jesus Christ. The city had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, but Christian pilgrims continued to journey there, often facing hostile conditions. By the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, was under increasing threat from expanding Muslim empires, particularly the Seljuk Turks. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, sent an urgent plea for help to Pope Urban II, who saw an opportunity to strengthen up. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont. He urged the knights and nobility of Europe to take up arms, promising them absolution from their sins and a place in heaven for those who participated. The Pope's call resonated deeply with the people of Europe, many of whom were driven by religious zeal, the desire for land, and the promise of wealth. The concept of the crusade was not merely a military campaign, it was framed as a holy mission, a pilgrimage that would lead to eternal salvation. This idea of religious war, sanctioned by the Church, gave the Crusaders a sense of divine piety. The First Crusade began in 1096 and was one of the most successful, leading to the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. However, this victory marked the beginning of a long and brutal conflict. Over the next few centuries, there would be several more crusades, each with different aims and varying degrees of success. Some crusades focused on defending Christian territories in the Holy Land, while others were directed towards Spain, the Reconquista, or even Aga. The Crusades had significant effects on the medieval world. The exposure to new cultures, technologies, and goods during the Crusades helped to spur the European Renaissance. Trade routes expanded, leading to the introduction of new goods like spices, textiles, and ideas from the Islamic world. On the other hand, the Crusades also entrenched religious intolerance and led to a legacy of conflict that persisted for centuries between Christians and Muslims. The violence and atrocities committed during the Crusades left deep scars in the collective memory of the regions involved. Overall, the Crusades were a defining feature of the Middle Ages, deeply intertwined with the religious, social, and political dynamics of the time. They were not just battles for territory, but for the very soul of Christendom, shaping the course of history in ways that still resonate today. As the Crusades raged on, countless knights and soldiers marched off to distant lands, answering the call of the Pope and seeking their place in the sacred struggle for Jerusalem. But what of those left behind? The women, often relegated to the background in the grand narratives of war, faced an entirely different set of challenges. The life of a crusader's wife was marked by difficult choices, both in daily survival and in their stance toward the conflict that consumed their husbands. Should they remain at home, waiting for their husband's return, or should they take up arms and join the battle themselves? For many women, the choice to stay behind was made for them by the societal norms of the time. Women, especially those of noble birth, were expected to maintain the household and raise children. The medieval period was one where women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and the idea of a woman participating in war was, at best, unconventional and at worst, scandalous. Yet many women, particularly the wives of knights and noble families, found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The uncertainty and peril of war created a paradox for these women. While society may have dictated that they remain at home and maintain their role as dutiful wives, many women felt the gnawing need to contribute to the cause directly. Some of these women were left with no choice but to manage their estates, ensure the safety of their families, and provide leadership during their husband's absence. These were no simple tasks, as the absence of a male head of the household left them vulnerable to political instability, raids, and potential attacks from enemies. They had to be resourceful, making tough decisions daily on how to defend their land and people, sometimes even taking up arms when necessary. Yet, there were some women who chose a different path, one less conventional, one that would have seemed unthinkable to many. These women, driven by their personal sense of duty, ambition, or perhaps their love for their husbands, chose to leave the safety of their homes and follow their knights into battle. They were not content to sit idly by while their husbands marched off to war. Their reasons for joining were varied. Some sought adventure, some followed out of loyalty, and others were driven by the belief that their involvement would bring them closer to the divine cause of reclaiming Jerusalem. One such example is the famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a noblewoman who not only accompanied her husband, King Louis VII, on the Second Crusade, but also played a central role in the political maneuverings of the time. While women like Eleanor were rare, their presence on the battlefield was enough to stir curiosity and challenge the gender expectations of the period. Though not all women had the power or the privilege to take part in such high-profile military campaigns, many found ways to contribute in their own right. Whether by offering medical assistance, rallying the troops, or even participating in smaller skirmishes, their contributions were crucial to the success of the Crusades. For those who stayed behind, life was no less fraught. The constant threat of attack, the fear of losing their husbands, and the burden of raising children alone placed immense stress on these women. Many would never see their husbands again, while others would have to endure long years of separation, with only sparse communication from the battlefield. These women were not passive figures in history. They were the unsung heroines, the silent warriors who fought their own battles on the home front, struggling to protect their homes and families amidst the chaos of war. The emotional toll on these women was tremendous. They carried the weight of their husbands' absences, their fears of betrayal or death, and the societal pressure to uphold their dignity. In some cases, the stress was so intense that it led to breakdowns or despair, while in others, it fostered a sense of resilience. The waiting game was not for the faint of heart. It was an emotional marathon that tested the very fabric of their identities and beliefs. In the end, the lives of Crusaders' wives were defined by the choices they had to make, choices that often went unnoticed by the grand narratives of the Crusades. Whether they stayed behind to manage the household or ventured forth to join their husbands in battle, these women were integral to the story of the Crusades. Their sacrifices, struggles, and courage may not be as well documented as the battles themselves, but their lives were no less significant in shaping the course of history. While their husbands were off fighting in distant lands, many Crusader wives were left behind to manage the home front. These women faced challenges that were both physical and emotional, as they took on roles that were traditionally reserved for men while simultaneously grappling with the uncertainty and danger of wartime life. The absence of their husbands during the Crusades was not just a personal loss. It was a period of immense hardship that tested their resilience and strength in ways few could have imagined. One of the most immediate challenges these wives faced was the responsibility of running the household on their own. In a time when men were traditionally the breadwinners and the head of the household, women were expected to manage the estate, handle financial matters, and ensure that everything ran smoothly. This task became even more difficult when the family's primary provider was absent. Wives had to ensure that the farm or estate was maintained, crops were harvested, and animals were cared for. In many cases, these women had to oversee not just the family's finances, but also the welfare of tenants, servants, and anyone else who depended on the estate for survival. The work was often grueling and left little time for rest or self-care. Beyond the day-to-day labor, the absence of their husbands created a deep emotional and psychological toll. Crusader wives were forced to live with uncertainty, not knowing whether their husbands were alive or dead. News from the front lines was scarce and unreliable, and when it did arrive, it was often months or even years old. The agony of waiting for letters, which might never come, or receiving news of a husband's injury or death, was a constant emotional burden. For many women, this sense of helplessness was overwhelming, and the fear of losing their loved ones weighed heavily on their hearts. In addition to the emotional strain, women also had to face the very real dangers that came with war. While their husbands were away, their homes were vulnerable to attack. Bandits, soldiers, and rival factions often preyed upon undefended villages and estates, leaving women to fend for themselves and their children. They were forced to learn how to defend their homes, even if it meant confronting marauding groups or managing the aftermath of raids. Some women took up arms, organizing local militias or working with their neighbors to protect what was theirs, but even this did not guarantee safety. The threat of violence, whether from local criminals or enemy forces, was an ever-present reality. The strain of raising children without the support of their husbands added another layer of difficulty. These women had to become both mother and father to their children, nurturing them emotionally while providing for their physical needs. They struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their families in the midst of chaos, instilling values of perseverance and strength in the next generation. The pressures of single-handedly raising children, often without the help of extended family, could be overwhelming, especially in times of scarcity, or when basic resources like food, clothing, and shelter were difficult to come by. Financial instability was another significant hardship that many Crusader wives faced. With their husbands away, many families were forced to rely on the estate's income, which was often insufficient to meet the needs of the household. Some women had to sell land, goods, or even their own personal possessions just to survive. The financial burden was exacerbated by the fact that many of these women had no formal education or training in managing finances, making it even more difficult to keep the household afloat. The stress of maintaining financial stability, while also ensuring that their families had enough to eat and live comfortably, was a constant challenge. Despite these overwhelming challenges, many Crusader wives managed to persevere. They exhibited immense strength and resourcefulness, finding ways to cope with the hardships that life had thrown their way. They formed close-knit communities with other women who were experiencing similar struggles, providing each other with emotional and practical support. In the absence of their husbands, these women learned to be independent, relying on their own ingenuity and resilience to ensure their family's survival. However, it is important to recognize that not all women had the same opportunities or resources to cope with these challenges. While some were able to manage the household successfully, others were not so fortunate. Many women suffered in silence, unable to access the help they needed, and lived in constant fear of losing everything they held dear. These women were often invisible in the historical narrative, their struggles and sacrifices overlooked by a society that focused more on the heroic deeds of their husbands than on the everyday battles they fought to keep their families intact. In conclusion, the life of a crusader's wife at home was fraught with difficulties. From managing the estate and defending their homes to coping with emotional distress and financial instability, these women faced extraordinary challenges. Yet, through it all, they demonstrated remarkable strength and resilience. The hardships they endured should not be forgotten, as they played a vital role in maintaining the social fabric of medieval society, even as their husbands fought in the distant, chaotic theatres of the Crusades. In medieval society, the role of women was often overshadowed by the prominent figures of kings, knights, and clergy, yet their influence and importance in daily life were undeniable. While the majority of women in the Middle Ages were confined to domestic roles and had limited rights and freedoms, they were far from passive. Women were the backbone of the household and played a crucial role in maintaining the structure of medieval society. The medieval family structure was patriarchal, and women were generally expected to marry, have children, and manage the home. However, this narrow view of their role did not account for the complex and dynamic contributions that women made to their communities. They were not just mothers and wives, but also skilled laborers, traders, and in some cases, leaders in their own right. Women managed estates, ran businesses, and were involved in the agricultural production that kept the medieval economy functioning. One of the most significant contributions of women in medieval society was their role in managing the household. While men were typically responsible for public affairs, it was the women who kept the home running. They were responsible for preparing food, weaving clothing, caring for children, and managing servants. In rural areas, women often worked alongside their husbands in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, and raising livestock. Their work in the home and on the land was essential to the survival of their families and communities. Women also played an important economic role, particularly in towns and cities. Many women were involved in crafts and trades, such as spinning, weaving, brewing, and pottery making. They often worked in family-run workshops, contributing to the production of goods that were sold in local markets. In some cases, women were able to establish their own businesses and become prosperous merchants. The guilds, which were associations of workers in various trades, allowed women to join and contribute to the economy, although they were often limited to certain professions, such as textiles or food production. The role of women in the church was another significant aspect of medieval society. While women were excluded from holding positions of power within the clergy, many women found ways to influence the religious sphere. Nuns, for example, played an important role in religious life. They ran convents, educated girls, and were often involved in charitable work. Some of the most well-known women of the medieval period were saints, mystics, and visionaries who had a profound impact on the church and society. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Joan of Arc were not only religious leaders but also symbols of the strength and determination of women in medieval society. In addition to their roles within the home, economy, and religious life, women were also important in the political sphere. While women were not typically allowed to rule in the same way as men, they held significant political power as queens, regents, and noblewomen. Queens such as Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of Castile wielded considerable influence in the politics of their time, and many noblewomen served as regents, managing their families' estates or governing in the absence of their husbands. These women were not just symbols of aristocracy, they were active political players, making decisions that affected the lives of their subjects. The importance of women in medieval society, however, was often undervalued, and their contributions went largely unrecognized by contemporary historians. The prevailing social order saw women primarily as mothers and wives, and their roles outside of the home were often seen as secondary or insignificant. Yet, the reality was that women were indispensable to the functioning of medieval society. Whether they were managing the estate, participating in trade, or contributing to the religious and political spheres, women's work shaped the course of history. It is important to recognize that the lives of medieval women were not uniform. Their experiences were shaped by their social class, region, and personal circumstances. Noble women had more opportunities to wield power and influence, while peasant women were often bound to their rural homes and struggled with poverty and hardship. However, regardless of their social status, women were central to the functioning of medieval society. Their work, though often invisible, was vital to the survival and prosperity of their families and communities. In conclusion, while the role of women in medieval society was often constrained by the rigid expectations of the time, they were far more than passive figures. Women were the lifeblood of medieval households, the stewards of the economy, and in many cases, influential figures in the religious and political spheres. Their contributions, though frequently overlooked, were essential to the fabric of medieval society, and their legacy should be acknowledged and celebrated. Women in the Middle Ages were not simply defined by their roles as wives and mothers, but were active participants in shaping the course of history. While the majority of women during the Crusades remained behind to manage households, there were some who, defying the traditional norms of medieval society, chose to accompany their husbands to the battlefield. The idea of women participating directly in combat or accompanying men on military campaigns was not the norm. In a time when women were expected to stay at home and tend to domestic affairs, the notion of a woman in armor, fighting alongside her husband, was an anomaly. Yet, the Crusades, with their religious fervor and promises of redemption, brought out an extraordinary kind of courage and determination in some women. These women not only provided moral and logistical support, but in certain cases, directly participated in the conflict, becoming active players in the brutal reality of war. The role of women during the Crusades was complex, as many wives who accompanied their husbands were not directly involved in combat, but still played vital roles. They acted as caretakers for the wounded, as cooks and providers of food, and as organizers of medical care for the soldiers. These women endured the hardships of war alongside their husbands, experiencing the pain and suffering of the campaign, but without the protection or recognition that the men received. Their contributions, though often overlooked, were crucial to the morale and survival of the troops. One of the most notable examples of a wife who participated in the Crusades was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages, and she played a significant role in the Second Crusade. In 1147, she accompanied her husband, King Louis VII of France, on the journey to the Holy Land. While Eleanor was not a combatant, her presence at the front lines was symbolic of her active participation in the religious and political cause of the Crusades. She was not just a passive bystander, but was involved in organizing supplies, overseeing the welfare of the troops, and managing logistics. Eleanor's decision to take part in the crusade also highlighted the important role noble women could play in supporting military campaigns and influencing political decisions. While Eleanor's story is one of the more well-documented examples, there were other women who made similar choices. Some noble women took up arms and fought alongside their husbands, using their influence and military skills to contribute to the success of the Crusades. These women were not driven by personal ambition, but by a sense of duty to their faith and to their husbands. In the face of such violence and turmoil, they often showed a bravery that transcended the roles typically assigned to women in medieval society. In addition to these noble women, there were also many lower-class women who followed their husbands to the Crusades, not out of privilege or power, but out of necessity. For many of these women, the Crusades provided an opportunity to support their families in a world where opportunities for advancement were few. These women would have been responsible for a wide range of activities, from tending to the sick and injured to providing food and water for the soldiers. They helped maintain the camp, keeping morale high, and ensuring that the troops could carry on their mission despite the hardships they faced. However, while the stories of women who fought or accompanied their husbands to battle are powerful, they were still the exception rather than the rule. For most women, their role in the Crusades was one of waiting and surviving rather than actively participating. The life of a crusader's wife who stayed behind was one of fear and uncertainty, constantly wondering whether her husband would return from the distant lands of the Holy Land. These women faced their own battles at home, dealing with the emotional toll of waiting, managing their estates, and protecting their families from the threats that arose in their absence. In conclusion, the story of the wives who joined the Crusades is one of resilience, courage, and defiance of traditional roles. These women did not merely stay in the background but played essential roles in the survival and success of the Crusades, often in ways that went unnoticed or underappreciated. Whether tending to the wounded, providing logistical support, or even wielding weapons themselves, these women made crucial contributions to the campaigns. Their stories, though less frequently told, offer a compelling reminder that women in the medieval period were not passive figures but active participants in the events that shaped history. While the Crusades are often remembered for the valor and glory of knights and kings, the stories of women who played significant roles in these religious wars are often overlooked. However, throughout the various Crusades, there were several notable women who, despite the gender norms of their time, took part in the conflict, either directly or through their influence. Their contributions ranged from military involvement to political maneuvering, and they shaped the course of history in ways that are not always acknowledged. One of the most famous women associated with the Crusades is Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful and influential figure in the 12th century. Although Eleanor is best known for her role as the Queen of France and later the Queen of England, she was also an active participant in the Second Crusade. In 1147, she accompanied her husband, King Louis VII of France, on the ill-fated expedition to the Holy Land. Eleanor's participation was groundbreaking for the time, as noble women typically did not travel with their husbands on military campaigns. She played a prominent role in the crusade, though her marriage to Louis eventually dissolved, partly due to their political and military failures during the campaign. Despite the Crusade's failure, Eleanor's involvement marked her as one of the few women who directly participated in such a significant military event. Another influential woman during the Crusades was Joan of Arc, who, though not a crusader in the traditional sense, can be considered part of the broader narrative of women in medieval warfare. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from France, led the French army to several important victories during the 100 Years' War. Her courage and leadership on the battlefield were not just symbolic but had real military and political consequences. Her involvement in warfare, though occurring after the main Crusader campaigns, reflected the spirit of women's involvement in the defense of Christian Europe during times of religious conflict. Further, Margaret of Anjou, the Queen Consort of Henry VI of England, became a crucial figure during the Wars of the Roses, a series of conflicts that overlapped with the period of the Crusades. Margaret displayed immense political and military skill, leading armies and managing political alliances during her husband's periods of instability. Her determination and strength during this turbulent time mirror the kind of influence wielded by women during the Crusades, even though she did not fight directly in a religious war. Her leadership highlights how women, even in times of war, could exert power and shape history. In the context of the Crusades, several other women provided critical support roles. The Crusader queens, like Queen Melisende of Jerusalem, who reigned alongside her son, Baldwin III, during the Crusader state's establishment in the Holy Land, are important examples. Melisende's rule was marked by her political acumen, which helped stabilize the region. Her role in governing Jerusalem during a period of intense conflict and shifting power dynamics showcased the ability of women to wield authority in the political sphere, ensuring the survival of Christian-held territories in the Middle East. Additionally, Matilda of Tuscany, who led her own army in support of the papacy during the investiture controversy, while not directly linked to the Crusades, laid the groundwork for later female involvement in religious and military matters. Her support of the Church helped solidify papal influence, indirectly facilitating the success of later Crusader campaigns. Her military leadership demonstrated that women could be formidable leaders in times of religious conflict. Though these women did not always fight in battles themselves, their roles in the Crusades, whether leading armies, negotiating treaties, or supporting military efforts, proved that women were far more than passive observers during this tumultuous period in history. These women's actions and decisions were vital in shaping the political and religious landscape of their time, and their legacy continues to influence how we view female leadership in history. The lives of the wives left behind during the Crusades were fraught with psychological and emotional challenges that few could have fully anticipated. While the men went off to fight in distant lands, the women remained at home, facing a different kind of war, one of fear, uncertainty, and isolation. Their emotional struggles were not just the result of personal loss, but were also rooted in the wider social and cultural pressures of the time, which demanded that they remain strong and stoic in the face of adversity. At the core of their emotional turmoil was the constant fear of not knowing whether their husbands would return. The Crusades, often lasting for years, were perilous journeys, and the letters or messages that occasionally reached home were fraught with uncertainty. The idea that their husbands might die in battle, be captured, or face horrific fates weighed heavily on their minds. For many wives, the absence of their husbands created a sense of deep emotional vulnerability. They were expected to be strong, to carry on with their daily lives as if everything were normal, but inwardly, they were consumed by worry. The fear of loss was constant, and the uncertainty of war left them in an emotional limbo, never knowing whether they would see their husbands again or if they would receive devastating news. In addition to the fear of losing their husbands, many women struggled with feelings of loneliness and isolation. During the Crusades, society's expectations for women were rigid, and their roles were primarily confined to domestic spaces. With their husbands away, these women were left to navigate a world that often felt hostile and uncertain. The isolation was not just physical, but emotional as well. Without the company of their husbands, many women found themselves surrounded by silence, their days filled with the responsibilities of maintaining their households, raising children, and ensuring the survival of their families. The lack of emotional support, especially in the absence of their partners, made these women feel even more alone, with no one to share their burdens or ease their anxieties. The weight of these emotional struggles was compounded by the heavy responsibilities that women were expected to shoulder. Managing estates, caring for children, and dealing with the day-to-day running of a household were not just chores, they were vital tasks that required constant vigilance. These responsibilities left little room for personal relief or emotional expression. The expectation for women to maintain composure and stability in the face of uncertainty meant that they often suppressed their own emotions. They were expected to be pillars of strength for their children and families, even if their own emotional stability was crumbling under the strain. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, many wives found ways to cope. Some turned to religion for comfort, praying for the safety of their husbands and the strength to endure. The church offered them a sense of community and spiritual solace, providing rituals, prayers, and a framework for understanding their suffering. For others, the prospect of revenge or justice for their husbands' potential deaths fueled a sense of empowerment, as they found ways to act as guardians of their family's honor and legacy. Interestingly, some women were able to find strength and resilience in their roles as protectors of their homes. The absence of their husbands placed them in a position where they had to assert control over their surroundings, taking on roles that were traditionally male-dominated. This shift in responsibilities, while difficult, also allowed them to tap into inner reserves of strength and capability they may not have realized they possessed. These women found power in their ability to protect their families, manage the estate, and maintain order during a time of great uncertainty. In conclusion, the psychological and emotional struggles of the Crusader's wife during the war were profound and multifaceted. The uncertainty of not knowing the fate of their husbands, the isolation and loneliness they endured, and the pressure to maintain their households under dire circumstances all contributed to a complex emotional landscape. Yet, despite the emotional toll of the Crusades, many women demonstrated incredible resilience and strength. Their ability to endure the constant worry, loneliness, and responsibility is a testament to the untold courage of the women who played such a vital role in the history of the Crusades. The Crusades, with their long and grueling campaigns, had a profound impact on the relationships between husbands and wives. For many, the separation caused by war-strained marriages, often changing the nature of their bonds. The emotional, psychological, and physical distance between couples during these years of conflict had lasting effects, not only on the individuals involved but also on the structure of their relationship. The challenges of maintaining a relationship while apart for long periods of time brought both tension and, at times, unexpected resilience. One of the most significant impacts of war on marital relationships was the emotional distance it created. With husbands away on crusades, wives were often left in a state of uncertainty, not knowing if they would ever see their spouses again. This uncertainty could erode trust and cause anxiety within the marriage. For the wife left behind, the fear of losing her husband was compounded by the realization that life would go on without him if he did not return. Even if the couple maintained correspondence during the war, the long delays in receiving letters and the occasional bad news only deepened the emotional gap. The wives, while managing the household, raising children, and maintaining the family estate, often had little time or energy to maintain the emotional intimacy of their marriage. They were consumed by their own struggles, leaving their emotional needs unmet. On the other hand, the absence of the husband also put immense pressure on the wife to take on new roles that might not have existed within the original framework of the marriage. She was forced to assume responsibilities that would traditionally fall to the man of the house, managing finances, overseeing property, making decisions, and even defending the home. This shift in power dynamics sometimes caused tension when the husband returned from battle. After being away for so long and dealing with the stresses of war, many men found it difficult to adjust to the fact that their wives had taken on leadership roles in their absence. This role reversal sometimes led to conflict, as both partners had to renegotiate their roles within the marriage, a process that was fraught with challenges. Another factor that affected marital relationships during the Crusades was the change in the husband's return. After years of fighting in brutal conditions, many crusaders returned home physically and emotionally scarred. The trauma of war, including the loss of comrades, witnessing brutal violence, and enduring physical hardship, had lasting effects on the men. These changes often made it difficult for them to re-engage with their wives and families in the same way they had before leaving for war. The emotional scars, including post-traumatic stress, could result in husbands becoming distant, withdrawn, or even hostile, complicating the emotional reintegration into family life. Wives, who had managed the household and carried the emotional burden of waiting, now found themselves facing a husband who might no longer be the man they had sent off to war. The re-establishment of intimacy in such relationships was often a slow and painful process, fraught with unresolved emotional issues. The separation also led to the temptation for infidelity, as long periods of absence left many husbands and wives seeking comfort elsewhere. The Crusades were not just a test of physical endurance, but also a test of marital fidelity. For some, the isolation and the uncertainty of the future made them more vulnerable to emotional or physical affairs. On the other side, some wives took on lovers, especially when the absence of their husbands stretched into years. In medieval society, such actions were often regarded with harsh judgment, but the reality of living without a spouse for long periods of time sometimes led to choices that could not be avoided. The strain of waiting and the emotional distance created by the war could, for some, lead to significant disruptions in the marriage. Despite these challenges, many couples also found that the war strengthened their relationship. The shared experiences of dealing with adversity, the bond created by waiting for the return of the husband, and the mutual hope that their relationship would survive the trials of war, often led to a renewed sense of devotion and intimacy. For some wives, the long absence of their husbands deepened their appreciation for their role in the relationship, while for others, it led to a stronger connection once their husbands returned, having fought alongside them in spirit through years of longing and uncertainty. In conclusion, the impact of war on marital relationships during the Crusades was multifaceted. For many couples, the emotional distance, role reversals, and trauma of war caused strain and sometimes even dissolution of their bonds. However, for others, the hardship of war served to bring them closer, as they navigated the challenges of separation, uncertainty, and reintegration together. The effect of these prolonged separations, and the intense emotional and psychological pressure of living in a time of war-shaped marriages in profound ways, leaving a lasting legacy on the relationships of those who lived through the Crusades. The lives of the wives of Crusaders were marked by extraordinary resilience, courage, and adaptability. While their husbands went off to fight in distant lands, often facing uncertain and dangerous fates. These women were left behind to manage households, estates, and families, all while contending with the emotional and physical challenges of war. The choices they made, whether to stay behind or support the war effort in their own ways, reflect the immense strength and determination these women had to summon to survive and thrive in an era defined by turmoil. From the daily hardships of managing a household without their husbands, to the emotional toll of waiting for news from the front lines, the wives of crusaders had to navigate a world of uncertainty, isolation, and responsibility. They were often expected to fulfill roles that were traditionally reserved for men, from defending their homes to making critical decisions for the future of their families. Yet, their contributions to the Crusades, though not always recognized, were vital. They kept the social and economic fabric intact, while their husbands fought for glory, often making sacrifices that went unnoticed by history. The stories of these women teach us important lessons about strength, perseverance, and the power of resilience. They remind us that heroism is not always found on the battlefield. It can also be found in the quiet, everyday battles of survival and perseverance. The lives of these women show that the greatest acts of courage often take place in the shadow of war, where those left behind become the silent but powerful forces that hold societies together in times of crisis. Through their endurance and determination, these wives demonstrated that even in the most challenging circumstances, the human spirit can endure and overcome. I woke up on the cold dirt floor, my limbs shaking, my head pounding, and the taste of metal in my mouth. I couldn't speak. My hands wouldn't stop twitching. Today, I'd probably be rushed to the ER, hooked up to machines, and surrounded by nurses in blue scrubs. But if this had happened to me 700 years ago, in a small medieval village tucked behind a crumbling monastery, I wouldn't be a patient. I'd be possessed. Someone would scream, another would grab a cross. And before I could even sit up, they'd be tying me to a bed with rough rope, whispering prayers and dousing my face with holy water. In the Middle Ages, illness wasn't a matter of medicine, it was a matter of morality. People didn't suffer from neurological disorders. They were cursed, infected by demons, punished by God. If you twitched, convulsed, or babbled nonsense, it wasn't because your brain misfired. It was because something had crawled inside you. Something dark, something evil. Epilepsy? That was Satan's favorite playground. Depression? A weakness of the soul. Schizophrenia? Witchcraft. Tourette's? Clearly unholy spirits speaking through your mouth. And the cure? Not rest, not herbs, not understanding, but prayers, chains, and sometimes fire. There are stories from across Europe of people dragged from their homes, tied to altars, exorcised in front of crowds. Some were dunked in rivers, others locked in monasteries. A few simply disappeared. I think about that, sometimes. How easy it would have been for someone like me to end up burned, drowned, or buried alive, not for anything I did wrong, but simply because I shook at the wrong time, in the wrong place, under the wrong moon. And I'm not alone. All across medieval Europe, ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, children, suffered in silence. Or worse, they suffered publicly, misunderstood, and feared. Because in a world without neurology, there was only theology. Without science, only superstition. This story isn't just about demons. It's about how fragile life was when your body betrayed you, and your neighbors thought it was the devil knocking. And tonight, we'll step into their world. Not to judge it, but to remember how far we've come, and how easily fear once wore the mask of faith. You might be wondering, how did people go from someone having a seizure to assuming the devil was at work? Well, to understand that, you have to let go of everything you know now. Science, biology, even basic first aid, and step back into a time when the line between the body and the spirit was blurry, very blurry. In the medieval world, people didn't see illness as just something wrong inside you. They believed everything was connected: the stars, your sins, the food you ate, and the way you spoke. If something broke down in your body, the assumption wasn't mechanical, it was spiritual, something bigger than you had taken control, something invisible, and almost always something malevolent. They didn't have words like neuron or serotonin, But they did have demons, and they had a whole lot of fear. It wasn't stupidity, it was survival. You see, the world back then was full of suffering. Crops failed, children died, plagues swept through towns without warning. Life felt like punishment already, so when someone started acting strange, it didn't take much to assume that supernatural forces were involved. And when the church, the most powerful authority, reinforced that idea, people believed it with their whole hearts. Priests told them that demons could enter the body through sinful thoughts, or even through dreams. That the devil preyed on the weak, especially women, the poor, and the mentally unstable. And if the church said you were possessed, you were possessed. End of discussion. Now imagine you're living in a small stone cottage. It's damp, cold, and full of smoke. Your cousin starts speaking in tongues in the middle of the night. They shout at invisible figures, hit their head against the wall, or laugh uncontrollably for hours. You don't think, maybe it's neurological. You think, oh God, they've been taken. And the treatments matched the fear. People were made to fast, pray, confess, bleed, or vomit. Some were whipped to drive out the demon. Others were subjected to exorcisms, rituals designed to terrify whatever evil spirit had made a home inside them. Sometimes it worked. Or at least, the symptoms stopped. But often, it just broke the person further. Of course, not every illness was seen as demonic, but the more invisible or emotional it was, the more suspicious it became. A fever? That might be a bad wind, or spoiled meat. But a girl who saw visions and spoke to angels? She could be a saint, or she could be burned at the stake. One of the most disturbing parts is that many people wanted to believe it was the devil. Because if it was the devil, it meant it wasn't their fault. It meant someone could help, that the priest had power, that God was watching. It gave suffering a purpose, even if that purpose was terrifying. And then there's the social pressure. In a tight-knit village, you couldn't afford to be different. If your behavior made others uncomfortable, or if you couldn't work the fields like everyone else, you became a threat, an outsider. People didn't just fear the devil in you, they feared what it said about them, about their safety, about their faith. And in many cases, possession became a story people told to survive. There are records of people pretending to be possessed to escape arranged marriages, to avoid going to war, or to justify strange behavior that had no explanation. Some believed it themselves. After all, if your whole community treats you like you're cursed, sooner or later, you might start to believe it too. It's easy, from a distance, to laugh, to roll our eyes at how medieval their thinking was. But try to imagine a world with no electricity, no painkillers, no MRI scans, just candles, superstition, and prayer. If someone screamed at the sky, it was a sign. If they stopped eating, or slept all day, or refused to speak, it wasn't depression, it was darkness. Inside them, the fear was real, and so was the suffering. What makes it more heartbreaking is how little compassion people could offer, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what else to do. When you believe your neighbor's pain is the work of hell itself, the instinct isn't to hold their hand, it's to protect your family, to look away, to bind, to burn. And still, through all that fear, people searched for meaning. They left offerings, lit candles, prayed through the night, because at the heart of it, they didn't want to hurt the people they loved. They wanted to save them, they just didn't know how. So they did what humans have always done in the face of the unknown. They made stories, they passed down rituals, they gave names to the darkness, so they wouldn't feel so powerless against it. Demons, devils, spirits, anything but the terrifying truth. Sometimes the body breaks, and no one knows why. By now you're probably starting to see the pattern. If you twitched, screamed, cried, or talked to someone who wasn't there, you weren't sick, you were dangerous. But let's get specific. What kinds of illnesses were most likely to get someone accused of being possessed? Let's start with epilepsy. If you've ever seen a seizure, you know it can be terrifying even today. The body stiffens, jerks uncontrollably. Sometimes the person foams at the mouth, loses consciousness, and makes sounds they can't control. In the 14th century, this wasn't interpreted as a medical event. It was a performance of the devil, a literal display of an internal spiritual battle. The ancient Greeks once believed epilepsy was a sacred illness, the sacred disease, they called it. But by medieval times, that sacredness had turned into suspicion. The church associated seizures with demonic activity. There were even rituals written specifically for casting out the epilepsy demon. Priests would lay hands on the afflicted, not to comfort them, but to trap whatever spirit was believed to be inside. Now, imagine being a child with epilepsy, growing up in a rural village where your first seizure happens during Sunday Mass. One moment you're kneeling in prayer. The next, you're on the floor, shaking, eyes rolled back. And when you wake up, half the town won't look you in the eye anymore. Next, we have schizophrenia, hearing voices, seeing things, speaking in ways that don't follow normal logic. In medieval times, that wasn't considered a medical diagnosis. It was possession, plain and simple. In fact, it fit the stereotype perfectly. The afflicted spoke in unknown tongues, reacted violently to religious symbols, and sometimes had complete personality shifts. It didn't help that some people with schizophrenia would quote scripture out of context, or act in ways that felt otherworldly. To a medieval priest, this wasn't mental illness. This was a spiritual war, and the person's body was the battlefield. Then there's Tourette syndrome. Imagine someone shouting obscenities without warning in the middle of a quiet chapel, or blinking, coughing, and twitching uncontrollably during a sermon. They'd be accused of mocking God, or worse, channeling a demon. In some parts of Europe, people with tics were believed to be under the influence of witches. Others were thought to be cursed by something their family had done generations ago. And what about depression? This one's tricky, because in many ways it was invisible. No screaming, no convulsing, no demonic voice. Just sadness, silence, withdrawal. In today's world, we'd recognize the signs. But in the Middle Ages, if you stopped speaking, stopped eating, or lay in bed for days, the villagers might think your soul had been taken. In some cases, melancholy was seen as a form of divine punishment, proof that God had turned his face away from you. In worse cases, it was treated as a spiritual vacancy. You weren't possessed, but your soul had left, making room for something else. Women were especially vulnerable to this. A grieving widow? Possibly cursed. A young girl refusing to marry? Suspect. A mother who stopped caring for her children after childbirth? There's a name for it now. Postpartum depression. Back then they simply called her dangerous, or unfit, or touched by the devil. Even bipolar disorder got caught in the fire. Periods of intense joy, creativity, even euphoria, followed by crashes into hopelessness and despair. To us, this is a clear sign of a mood disorder. But to a 15th century monk, that was someone flirting with both angels and demons, jumping between divine inspiration and hellish temptation. And autism? Children who didn't make eye contact, who flapped their hands, who didn't speak when expected, or spoke in repetitive patterns. Many were thought to be changelings, mythical children swapped by fairies to punish the parents. Some were abandoned, others were cleansed, in rituals involving cold water, smoke, or worse. We can't forget hysteria, a diagnosis historically slapped on women for everything from anxiety to migraines to simply being outspoken. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. The belief was that the womb wandered inside the body, causing madness. Treatments ranged from herbs to intimate interventions, usually performed by clergy or healers. And sometimes, the most dangerous illness wasn't in the mind or body, but in the social context. A woman speaking her mind, a man crying too often, a child with too much imagination. These weren't medical red flags. They were spiritual alarms, because the medieval world didn't have room for different. You fit, or you feared. You worked, or you were watched. You behaved, or you burned. And so, people with all kinds of conditions, neurological, psychological, emotional, were lumped into one terrifying, misunderstood category: possessed. Their symptoms weren't treated. They were punished. And yet, many of them survived. Somehow, their stories echo through the dusty pages of Inquisition records, hidden in marginal notes of old parish logs, sometimes whispered in old folk songs. The boy who screamed at night, the woman who danced through fields alone, the girl who talked to trees. They weren't evil, they were unwell. But in a world ruled by fear and faith, that was all it took. If I lived in the Middle Ages and someone thought I was possessed, I wouldn't be taken to a doctor, I'd be taken to a priest. There would be no diagnosis, no quiet room, no comforting voice asking how I felt. Instead, I'd likely be dragged, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, into the cold stone walls of a church or monastery. The candles would be lit, the air thick with incense, and the ritual would begin. This wasn't medicine, it was warfare, spiritual warfare. To medieval minds, sickness of the mind or body wasn't a biological glitch, it was an invasion. And exorcism, that was the only cure. Whether you were trembling, weeping uncontrollably, speaking in strange voices, or simply not behaving the way others expected, the solution was to get the evil out. It started with prayer, always prayer, but it didn't stay gentle for long. Some exorcisms involved nothing more than whispered Latin verses and drops of holy water, but others, they were violent. Physical, terrifying. The afflicted might be strapped down to prevent injury or escape. They could be screamed at, slapped, or forced to swallow blessed herbs and oils that burned going down. Some were even whipped, to drive the demon from the flesh. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm not. Historical records tell of people gagged with cloth soaked in vinegar, doused repeatedly in freezing water, or burned lightly with hot metal to scare the devil out. If someone screamed, it was confirmation. If they cried, it was progress. If they fainted, it meant the demon was weakening. It didn't matter whether it helped. What mattered was the performance, the ritual, the belief that someone was doing something. In many rural villages, there weren't even trained priests, just holy men, charm sellers, or cunning women who claimed they could cure curses. Their tools? Salt, smoke, iron, prayers, and pain. One recipe called for tying the afflicted to a tree overnight while singing psalms. Another involved burying a live animal beneath the floorboards of the sick person's home to absorb the evil. Then there were pilgrimages. Families would walk miles, sometimes across countries, carrying their trembling son or their mute daughter to a holy shrine or relic, often hoping that simply being near a saint's bones would drive the demons away. For many, it was the only hope they had. For others, it was the last one. And let's not forget fasting, a favorite of both church and lay people. The logic was simple. Demons thrived in the body, so you had to starve them. People were denied food, water, even sleep. A possessed person might be kept awake for days, while others prayed over them. The goal wasn't rest. It was exhaustion. A worn-down body was easier to cleanse, or break. Exorcisms weren't always private either. Sometimes they were public spectacles, performed in the town square, in front of crowds. Imagine your darkest hour, your most vulnerable state, being treated as community theatre, people watching, whispering, judging, hoping they weren't next. And not all who went through exorcism came out alive. Some simply wasted away. Others were accidentally, or intentionally, killed in the process. The logic? If the person died, perhaps the demon did too. And if not, well, maybe they were beyond saving. It's horrifying. But here's the twist. Not everyone saw it that way. To many people at the time, exorcism wasn't cruelty. It was care, a desperate form of help from people who had nothing else. Parents submitted their children to these rituals because they truly believed it would save them. Villagers whispered the prayers harder, hoping it would spare someone they loved. Even those performing the rituals, priests, monks, or self-proclaimed healers, often acted from belief, not malice. It wasn't evil, it was ignorance and fear. Some accounts show how people genuinely rejoiced when someone was healed after an exorcism. Maybe the child calmed down, maybe the voices stopped. Maybe the symptoms faded on their own, as they sometimes do, and everyone took it as proof, a sign that the devil had been cast out. They cheered, they cried, they thanked God. Even if the person wasn't better, even if the pain stayed, even if the trauma ran deep, and if the exorcism didn't work, there was always another explanation. Maybe the demon was too strong. Maybe it was multiple demons. Maybe the patient had invited the possession by sinning. Maybe they weren't human anymore. And that, perhaps, is the darkest corner of this history. Because once a person was seen not as someone suffering, but as a vessel for evil, compassion became very hard to find. You don't soothe a demon. You fight it, you beat it, you burn it. That was the logic, and it broke countless lives. So no, I'm not afraid of demons. I'm afraid of what people do when they think you're no longer one of them. And how often they've called it healing. Let me tell you a true story. It's the year 1790. France is still shaking from the revolution. The monarchy has fallen, and a new age of reason is dawning, or so they say. Science is gaining ground, but old beliefs still cling like cobwebs in the corners of society. And in the heart of Paris, there's a woman named Geneviève. She's 27, educated, but poor, lively, curious. The kind of woman who speaks her mind too much for her own good. She writes poetry. Sometimes she talks to herself while walking through the market. She doesn't marry, though many think she should. One day, after weeks of insomnia and sudden bursts of tears, she collapses during Sunday Mass. She doesn't faint. She screams, loud, long, incoherent. The priest says she's been touched. The baker's wife whispers, hysteria. Within a week, she's taken away. Not to a hospital, to La Salpêtrière, a sprawling, infamous institution in Paris known as a hospital, but in truth, more like a prison for women society didn't know what to do with. Some were mentally ill. Some had epilepsy. Some were just old, poor, or inconvenient. Geneviève was admitted as a case of chronic hysteria. That diagnosis, hysteria, was a catch-all term used for centuries to describe women who acted strangely, crying too much, laughing at the wrong moment, being angry, being sad, being tired, being sexual, being too sexual, or not sexual enough. The word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. The theory? That the uterus could wander inside the body, causing chaos in the mind. Some doctors genuinely believed that to heal hysteria, they needed to anchor the womb with smoke, pressure, or, more disturbingly, manual intervention. But back to Geneviève. At La Salpêtrière, she is stripped, washed, and given a wooden bed in a cold, damp room. No privacy, no freedom. Her treatments involve cold water baths, fasting, isolation, and daily moral readings, sermons shouted at her by priests while she's forced to kneel on stone floors. When she refuses to eat, they say it's a sign of the demon resisting. When she cries, they say it's guilt. When she is quiet, they say it's the silence before an outburst. No matter what she does, it's seen as a symptom. Doctors visit weekly, not to treat, but to observe. Salpêtrière was a place where medicine blurred into spectacle. Physicians brought students to study the hysterical women, watching them twitch, tremble, scream, or fall into catatonic stillness. Some patients were forced to perform their fits on command. If they didn't, they were punished. If they did, they were written about in journals as evidence of demonic possession, moral failure, or female weakness. There are records, real ones, of doctors using metal instruments to test women's reactions to pain, to fire, to sudden sound. One physician wrote proudly that a woman in full hysteria will react as if no longer human. She is creature, not person. Geneviève stayed at Salpêtrière for 3 years. She never left. Her records say she died peacefully. But there's no real account of how, no autopsy, no investigation, just a note. Another line in a dusty ledger. Another woman silenced in the name of medicine, morality, and fear. And she wasn't the only one. From the 1600s to the early 20th century, thousands of women across Europe were institutionalized for what we'd now call anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, postpartum trauma, even simple grief. Many were treated not as patients but as problems to be stored, studied, or shamed. Some were wives deemed difficult. Others were daughters who spoke back. A few were simply poor or unwanted. And hysteria wasn't just a French problem. In England, women were sent to madhouses, where they were bled, beaten, or left to rot. In America, some were sterilized under eugenics programs, labeled as feeble-minded, for reading novels or being too quiet. In Italy, women with opinions were diagnosed with moral insanity. It was a global epidemic of misunderstanding, and for centuries it wore a white coat. Today, hysteria as a diagnosis is mostly gone, at least in name. But its legacy lives on in how we talk about emotions, especially in women. She's overreacting. She's being dramatic. Too emotional to be rational. Maybe it's her hormones. Sound familiar? Sometimes I think about Genevieve, not just as a story from the past, but as a mirror. Because while we've made progress, so much progress, there are still echoes. In every woman who gets dismissed at the doctor's office, in every person told their pain is in their head, in every teenager locked away instead of listened to. La Salpêtrière is still standing today, part hospital, part museum. You can walk its halls, read the names, see the instruments, but the real ghosts aren't in the walls, they're in the silence. The lives no one recorded, the women no one believed, and sometimes the ones we claimed we were trying to heal. At some point, people stopped blaming demons for everything. Well, mostly. The truth is, the transition from exorcisms to diagnoses didn't happen in one dramatic moment. There was no grand announcement where everyone packed up their holy water and swapped it for stethoscopes. The shift came slowly, unevenly, and for a long time, it was messy. But it began, truly began, when we started asking why instead of just praying it would stop. The Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries brought a wave of intellectual curiosity across Europe. People began to question not only the divine right of kings, but also the divine explanations for disease. Scholars started collecting data, observing patterns, and building theories that didn't require ghosts or sin to make sense. One of the earliest examples? Thomas Willis, a British physician in the 1600s who studied the brain's anatomy and coined the term neurology. He was among the first to suggest that seizures might be the result of something going wrong in the brain, not an unholy spirit lodged in the soul. Revolutionary, right? And still, most people ignored it. Because while thinkers and doctors were scribbling down new ideas in lecture halls and libraries, villages were still tying people to posts when they screamed at night. Science was moving forward, but belief? Belief takes its time. It wasn't until the 19th century that the medical world began to truly reclaim what we now call mental health. Doctors like Jean-Martin Charcot began studying patients at places like La Salpêtrière in Paris, the same asylum from Genevieve's story. But instead of treating these women as cursed, he began to document their symptoms carefully, photograph them, and look for clinical patterns. His work laid the groundwork for Sigmund Freud, who would later popularize the idea that hysteria wasn't a spiritual disease, but a psychological one, something rooted in memory, trauma, desire, something that could be talked through. Now, Freud got plenty of things wrong. Let's not kid ourselves. But his work marked a major shift, a movement from exorcism to analysis, from punishment to understanding. Around the same time, pharmaceuticals began to emerge, sedatives, antipsychotics, treatments that, for the first time in history, actually changed how the brain functioned, chemically. This was both a miracle and a minefield. Suddenly, what was once considered madness became treatable, labelable, sometimes even manageable. But with medicine came institutionalization, and that wasn't always progress. Large psychiatric hospitals sprang up across Europe and America, promising humane care. Some delivered, many didn't. While the demons may have been exorcised from the theory, the cruelty remained in practice. People were still locked away, still isolated, still misunderstood. It wasn't just the systems. It was the stigma. Society was slow to accept that mental illness wasn't a moral failing, that a mother with postpartum depression wasn't a bad parent, that a soldier with flashbacks wasn't weak, that a child who didn't speak wasn't broken. It's easy to forget now, but well into the 20th century, families hid mentally ill relatives in attics, communities whispered, schools excluded, employers judged. Science had entered the chat, but the ghosts of the old world lingered. Even today, language betrays us. We say someone lost their mind. We describe bad behavior as insane. We still call angry women hysterical. But let's not overlook the wins, because they're real, and they matter. The invention of the MRI allowed doctors to see brain structures in real time. Advances in neurochemistry revealed imbalances that once masqueraded as curses. Therapy became mainstream. Support groups formed. Mental health campaigns reached schools, workplaces, governments. And most importantly, people started listening. When someone says, "I'm not okay," it doesn't trigger an exorcism. It triggers a conversation, a referral, a plan. Sure, it's not perfect. Access is still unequal. Treatments don't work for everyone. And stigma hasn't vanished, it's just learned to whisper instead of shout. But at least we know now. People aren't possessed. They're in pain. They don't need to be bound. They need to be heard. That shift, from punishment to empathy, is probably the most important medical discovery of all. Still, some corners of the world haven't made that shift yet. In rural communities, even today, mental illness is seen as weakness. In some places, it's still blamed on evil spirits. I've met people whose parents took them to spiritual healers instead of clinics, who were told to pray harder instead of ask for help, who were shamed, silenced, or isolated. Sometimes, the devil still gets credit for things he had nothing to do with, and sometimes, the science isn't enough, because science explains, but belief comforts. And when you're scared, or grieving, or watching someone you love spiral into something you don't understand, you'll reach for whatever makes you feel less helpless. That's not ignorance. That's being human. The beauty of where we are now is that we don't have to choose between science and soul, between medicine and meaning. We can say, "I believe in serotonin and spiritual healing." We can light a candle and take our meds. We can go to therapy and still pray at night. We've come far, not because we stopped believing, but because we started understanding. And that understanding, that's how we banish the real demon, fear. Some wounds don't bleed, they don't bruise, they don't scream. They just sit there, quietly, like fog in the mind. And for most of history, that fog was treated not as illness, but as weakness. We call it depression now, but for centuries, it was something else entirely. If you couldn't get out of bed, you were lazy. If you didn't want to eat, you were spoiled. If you couldn't stop crying, you were overly emotional. And if you said you felt nothing at all, people simply looked away. Let's rewind. In medieval times, depression had many names: melancholia, acedia, sloth. But one thing was always true. It was never seen as medical. It was moral. Acedia, for example, was one of the original spiritual diseases described by monks in the 4th century. It meant spiritual listlessness, a kind of holy fatigue, a sin of the soul. Monks who didn't feel like praying or working were accused of letting the devil into their hearts. Their symptoms, exhaustion, sadness, detachment, sound a lot like what we'd call clinical depression today. But back then, they were condemned for spiritual laziness. They were told to pray harder, fast longer, whip themselves for penance, and if they didn't get better, it meant they didn't try hard enough. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, and the picture doesn't improve much. Doctors had begun talking about the nervous system, but emotional suffering was still seen as something you should just overcome, especially if you were a man. Men were expected to be stoic, controlled, rational. If they wept or withdrew, they were mocked. If they showed sadness, they were called unmanly, or worse. Women, on the other hand, had a different problem. Their sadness was seen as natural, expected even, so when they showed signs of depression, it wasn't taken seriously. It was dismissed. She's just being dramatic. It's her cycle. She'll get over it. In both cases, the message was the same. You're not sick, you're just failing. And that belief, so simple, so poisonous, caused immeasurable harm. Because when you believe depression is laziness, you don't help the person suffering. You pressure them. You shame them. You push them further into the dark. Imagine a farmer in the 14th century who wakes up one morning and simply can't. He can't move, can't think, doesn't feel hunger, doesn't care if the animals are fed. What do his neighbors say? He's cursed, or lazy, or drunk. No one considers that he might be drowning in something invisible. Or think of a young wife in the 1800s, a few weeks after childbirth. She's overwhelmed, detached, numb. They say she's a bad mother, that she's selfish, that she doesn't love her child. They never say postpartum depression, because that word doesn't exist yet. And so, people suffered in silence, for years, decades, sometimes whole lifetimes, because they were never told they were allowed to feel this way, only that they shouldn't. What's worse is that these misunderstandings didn't just come from strangers. They came from friends, from family, from people who loved them but didn't know better. My father used to say I was just being lazy. One woman from the 1920s wrote in her journal. He said I had a good life and no reason to be sad. He said if I didn't get up, he'd drag me out of bed himself. She never told anyone how badly she wanted to disappear. And that's the real cost of misunderstanding. It isolates the people who need connection the most. When you treat sadness as laziness, pain as weakness, or numbness as failure, you don't just miss the illness, you turn it into shame, and shame is sticky. It stays long after the symptoms fade, sometimes longer than the person. Even today, echoes of this thinking remain. People with depression are told to just get outside, think positive, be grateful, try yoga. None of it is malicious. It sounds helpful. But underneath, there's a dangerous message. If you're still struggling, it's your fault. And that's simply not true. Depression is not a choice. It is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is an illness, complex, varied, deeply human. And we know better now. We have therapy, medication, research, support groups. We have words, and language matters. Because when we name something, we make it real. And when it's real, we can help. So, if you've ever felt broken and been told to try harder, if you've ever mistaken your own exhaustion for failure, if you've ever thought, why can't I just be normal? You are not alone. You are not lazy. You are not possessed. You are feeling what countless people across history have felt, only now we finally have the language to say it out loud. And that changes everything. Let me be clear. Not everything our ancestors believed was wrong, and not every ritual they performed came from ignorance. It's easy to look back on the past and laugh at it, to roll our eyes at holy water and burning herbs, at chanting monks and possessed goats. But when we do that, we flatten history. We miss something important. We miss the why, because for people living in the medieval world, or any pre-scientific society, spirituality wasn't a side dish. It was the whole plate. There were no hospitals, no therapy, no neurology, no psychiatry, no blood tests or brain scans, just the body, the spirit, and the terrifying mystery in between. And when something went wrong, when a loved one began screaming at shadows or stopped speaking entirely, what else could you reach for, except the divine? Think of a mother, in the 12th century, watching her son collapse in seizures. She has no words for epilepsy, no concept of neurons misfiring. All she knows is that one moment he was fine, and the next, he was shaking. His eyes rolled back, his body no longer his own. She panics, she prays, she calls the priest, because she has to do something. She has to believe something. And belief, for her, is not a luxury, it's a lifeline. When we judge the past by modern standards, we risk becoming arrogant. We assume that if people didn't have facts, they had foolishness. But that's not true. Many so-called superstitions were deeply rooted in emotional logic, ways to cope with what couldn't yet be explained. They were imperfect, yes, but they were human. When the world gave no answers, people made meaning, because meaning helps you survive what might otherwise break you. Take exorcisms, for example. Some were brutal, yes, but some were also strangely intimate. They involved touch, voice, ceremony. The afflicted weren't cast out of the community. They were surrounded, held, prayed over. Their suffering was seen and shared. In that context, the ritual was less about fighting a demon and more about naming the pain, making it visible, giving the invisible thing a shape, and then trying to remove it. Does that sound so different from therapy? Sit in a quiet room. Speak your pain aloud. Let someone guide you through it. Replace holy water with CBT, and the bones aren't so different. Of course, we have better tools now. Science has given us clarity, medicine, and nuance. But don't mistake that for superiority, because science, too, began with mystery, and mystery still has its place. In fact, many people today still blend science with spirituality in how they heal: prayer and Prozac, meditation and medicine, ritual and recovery. Not because they're confused, but because healing is not just about the brain, it's about the soul. You don't have to believe in demons to understand the need to light a candle when things feel dark. You don't have to believe in spirits to understand the power of sitting with someone who's hurting and just being there. That presence is sacred, always has been, and even back then, yes, even in the darkest centuries, there were moments of grace in the madness. Villagers who sat beside the possessed all night, whispering lullabies. Mothers who protected their strange children from being taken. Priests who broke the rules to spare a life. Communities that didn't always cast out the different, but sometimes adopted them into new roles. The holy fool, the seer, the village wise one. Not every story ends in fire. Sometimes it ends in understanding, imperfect, but real. Even the belief in possession wasn't always fear-based. In some cultures, being possessed meant you were chosen, that you had been touched by the divine, not corrupted by evil. Shamans, oracles, spirit walkers, people who spoke to invisible things and were honored for it. We often forget that mental illness and spiritual vision have long walked side by side, and that line, it's always been blurry. Even today, we ask questions science can't answer. Why does one person survive trauma and another doesn't? Why does music heal some people in ways no pill ever could? Why do we feel better after crying at a stranger's grave? The answer isn't always because chemicals. Sometimes it's because we're human, and humans need stories, symbols, and rituals, not because we're superstitious, but because we're searching for connection, for comfort, for control. So, was everything our ancestors believed correct? Number. But was it always foolish? Also no. Sometimes, rituals that seem silly were attempts to show love, to say, I see your pain, and I'm not turning away, to fight for someone in the only language they had. And when I think about all the people who were misunderstood, the ones who were called lazy, or cursed, or possessed, I wonder how many of them might have felt just a little safer, just a little less alone, because someone lit a candle, or whispered a prayer, or simply sat beside them when no one else would. In the end, healing is not about being right, it's about being there. And that, our ancestors understood more than we give them credit for. For thousands of years, when something went wrong in the mind, the world didn't know what to call it, so it called it evil, possession, curses, demons. People weren't seen as hurting, they were seen as haunted. And maybe that made it easier for everyone else. Easier to explain, easier to blame, easier to separate us from them. But what history shows us, again and again, is that the line between sick and possessed was never about morality. It was about misunderstanding. A seizure wasn't the devil. It was electricity misfiring in the brain. Hearing voices wasn't a curse. It was a symptom, with causes, with patterns, with pain. And beneath it all, these weren't monsters. They were people. People like Genevieve in the madhouse, like the child who screamed at night in a village chapel, like the mother who stopped smiling after her baby was born. They weren't weak, or wicked, or dangerous. They were overwhelmed, undiagnosed, unheard, and honestly, sometimes we still are. Because even now, in this so-called age of progress, there are moments when the old ghosts creep back in. We don't call it possession anymore, but we still say, he's just being difficult, or she's too emotional, or they're not trying hard enough. We still dismiss, still judge, still turn away from what we don't understand. But the truth is simple. Mental illness isn't a flaw. It's not failure. It's not a curse. It's the brain raising its hand, quietly, saying, I need help. Not holy water, not punishment, just help. The people of the past didn't know that. We do. And that gives us a choice. We can repeat their fear, or we can listen, with compassion, with context, with care, because when we look at those old stories of exorcisms and accusations and women locked away, not with mockery, but with empathy, something shifts. We don't just judge the past, we learn from it. We see how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So if you've ever felt broken or strange or scared by what your mind is doing, you are not possessed, you are human, with a brain that's trying, in its own messy way, to protect you, to survive, and sometimes to cry out. And now, we finally know how to listen.